Okay. So it looks like we are live. Yeah. Okay, so good evening, good day, good morning to everyone in attendance here. I'd like to welcome you all to our International Primatology Lecture Series, the past, present, and future perspectives of the field. This is event organized by the Center for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology at Kyoto University. And this is going to be our 14th, I believe it says 13 here. It should be the 14th lecture in our series, which is going to be given by Dr. Ian Redmond. And as we do for all of these events, I would like to pass it over to Dr. Michael Huffman for the introductions.
Thanks,
Mike?
Andrew. Ian, welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you joining us. We've had some very interesting talks over this series, but I think we can all expect some really interesting stories from you today. Ian has spent a lot of time in Africa, traveled around the world a lot, as he's always attending different conservation meetings and on the ground as well. Trying to outrun elephants and rhinos and gorillas and whatnot. But he's a very dynamic researcher, conservationist, very dedicated to his field. And he's no stranger to Japan. He's been here and has many close friendships with primatologists here in Japan who he's worked with over in Africa. And I'm sure we'll be hearing about some of those stories as well. But it's really a great pleasure to welcome you to the series, Ian. And without further ado, I'll let you have at it.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for inviting me to speak in this lecture series. I'm now going to, well, first of all, I regret that I'm not in Japan and that we're not all in a room together and go out afterwards for a glass of sake. But given that we're all in our little boxes watching this on technology, you'll have to bear with me while I press the share screen thingy. Click that, go to share. And can you just confirm that you're now seeing—
You're good to go.
My opening slide? Woohoo! Technology that works is always so much more gratifying than technology that doesn't. Yes. So I'd like to do a little bit of a retrospective of the past 45 years or so that I have been involved in conservation, which was not my intention. And I think I was pushed into it out of necessity. I describe myself as a naturalist by birth, because I think naturalists are just born that way. They're just fascinated with all life forms. A biologist by training, because it's hard to just make a living as a naturalist. You need to have an ologist title to you. And I sometimes get called a primatologist or a zoologist or an ecologist. And I also get called a conservationist. But I'm a conservationist by necessity because of the things that have happened to me. So let me summarize those things. But I'd like you to see these events over the past few decades in the context of what's happening today. So this week, why isn't my slide advancing? Okay, just when I thought I had this technology sorted, I am screen sharing. Stop share. Just hold on a second, folks. Let me work out why this isn't advancing. I seem to be stuck on the opening slide, and my escape button doesn't control. Task manager. This is exciting. You're not seeing this excitement going on, but
this is what happens in the real world, though, Ian. It's no problem at all. We will bear with you here.
End task. Right. That's good. Look at that. I opened up a task manager, ended my PowerPoint task, and I'm now going to reopen my PowerPoint. Put it to like that, and then exit my screen share again. You don't realize how extraordinary this is, but if I share that, you're seeing it like that. And if I go into that and press that, and I want to enable content, it keeps asking me. We have to remember that from the last time. What are you seeing at the moment? I'm screen sharing.
Yeah, we have your presentation.
Opening slide. Now the magic. Yes, I
And
have
it
advanced the
moves.
slide.
Yes.
Okay, we have liftoff. I wanted to set the talk in the context of what's happening this week in Bonn, where the IPBES representatives of 139 countries are joined together to discuss what is designed to be the influential body to direct policy on biodiversity, in the same way that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has influenced the discussions at the climate conference, climate convention talks. So all these UN bodies are endeavoring to improve the way we govern ourselves and our interaction with nature. And the UN has a number of conventions relating to nature. I'm sure you're familiar with CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. And the CBD was supposed to have its big meeting in 2020, where it was going to agree, it being the parties, the 180 odd countries that are parties to that convention, were going to agree on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The UN is very good at snappy titles and easily forgettable acronyms. But IPBES, if you haven't come across it before, it's in the right-hand corner, the Intergovernmental Platform on Policy for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And those are the key words, biodiversity and ecosystem services. Why does that matter to primatologists? Because primates in their habitat are keystone species. They play an important role. Many other species are ecologically dependent on them. And if you lose the primates from that habitat, then that habitat, that ecosystem is likely to collapse, or certainly see significant changes, not necessarily the next day, but the next decade or the next century. And that's often tied to seed dispersal, which we'll talk about as we come along. So this is this morning's Twitter feed. This week, this is happening in Bonn. The UK has a new Chancellor of the Exchequer, resignations, political stuff, and the political backdrop to these UN negotiations is important because politicians form the legislative framework in which companies operate, in which we all live. And we're all I hope we're all law-abiding citizens and we want to obey the law, but sometimes the laws are not good for nature. They do not protect nature in a way that allows the biosphere to continue to function. And we're seeing the results of poor planning and bad laws with the interlocking crises we're facing. The three big ones are climate change as a result of global warming, biodiversity loss leading to ecosystem collapse and the loss of the processes that keep us all alive, and pollution, plastic, petrochemicals, whatever kind of pollution. But those three are likely to so transform life on Earth that our future as a species, and certainly our civilization, as we like to call it, is in question. And these big international meetings are set against the backdrop of each one of those 139 countries meeting in Bonn have the same sort of political turmoil going on at home, with ministers changing and elections and MPs that design the laws to govern a country are fixed on their political cycle. When is the next election, and are they going to get in? And they don't want to take bad decisions that will affect that outcome. And yet, what we need for biodiversity planning is long-term planning, not short-term thinking for political reasons. So that's kind of the backdrop of what I'm talking about. And people can protest. I have been on protest. Here we are outside Parliament doing an interview for a journalist at an Extinction Rebellion protest, where around me, incredibly courageous people were gluing themselves to the pavement. And what an extraordinary thing to do. Just stop and think for a moment what it feels like to say, okay, today I'm going to super glue myself to a building or to a road and cause disruption. Why am I going to do that? Because I think the normal way of just standing there with a banner saying, please stop destroying nature, hasn't worked. And I've been involved, as you'll have gathered by now, for 40-something years, trying to change the course of this series of events that humans are responsible for, that is leading to the destruction of the ecosystems that sustain us all. And I think that primatology is one of the most important sciences within that debate, but I don't see enough primatologists engaging with this. So part of what I'm hoping to do today is to encourage you, not necessarily to glue yourself to the pavement outside of your respective parliament or some company headquarters to ask them to stop destroying nature, but to engage. So requires leadership from politicians and corporate leaders to turn around the climate crisis. That was what Extinction Rebellion was focused on. But notice the name they chose. It wasn't Climate Rebellion, it was Extinction Rebellion, because tied to the climate crisis is this loss of biodiversity, and we're potentially facing our own extinction, or at least a drastic change in our situation on the planet. So that's the serious stuff. Now about elephants. I have to bring elephants into this picture. There have been primatological conferences where people have presented papers on elephants, so they're almost honorary primates because their society is so similar to some primates, it's quite similar to ours in some respects. And in terms of their role in the ecosystems where they live across Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia, they are where they've been described as super keystone species by the late Hezi Shoshani. And whereas I talk a lot about primates being the gardeners of the forest, elephants have been dubbed the mega gardeners of the forest, just because of their size, their appetite. They obviously have a huge impact on the ecosystem in which they live and which they are a critical part of. So we will talk about elephants. These are forest elephants. These are actually in the Virungas, and this group of forest elephants had just interacted with a group of gorillas that I was sitting observing, and I hadn't seen this group of gorillas for some years. So the young silverback, who I knew as a child, Pablo, had looked around and was looking at me, and then he was staring at me. I'm sure he's pleased to see me, hasn't seen me for a while, but why is he staring? And I realized that behind me, there was a herd of elephants and he was staring at the elephants and I was just in the way. So he came past me and interacted with the elephants. He approached them and beat his chest. Now, I should mention that the number of forest elephants in the Veronica Volcanoes is a fraction of what it was in the 60s and early 70s. I arrived at Karisoki in 1976, just after the last of the resident herd of elephants had been killed by ivory poachers. And this was 20 years later. And these were probably the first elephants that many of the younger gorillas had seen. And they were climbing trees to get a better look. Fascinated. And I contend that gorillas are themselves naturalists. They are fascinated by other life forms. And if they're not scared and running away, then they are curious and want to observe. And Pablo did more than observe. He came forward and beat his chest in front of the elephants. And a young male elephant stepped forward and stuck his ears out. And these two young males of their respective species did a face-off. And then the elephants moved away. and Pablo strutted past me. You know, he'd seen them off. And then he decided to go and investigate further and followed the elephants. And I followed Pablo following the elephants. And I climbed a tree to see what was going on. And again, I saw him chest beat. I saw the young male elephant ears out. I have a picture of that, but they're just dots in the foliage. You can't really see what's going on. And then the elephants moved off again, and he moved on again, and I followed again, and then he was coming back. So at least 2, possibly 3 times, he interacted with the elephants, and the elephants backed down, and he came back, and he was obviously really tense because he grabbed my colleague by the rucksack and dragged her across the clearing, just releasing that tension in an entirely harmless but quite entertaining way. So that's, you said you wanted some stories. There's one. In my mind, one of the very few observations of interactions between gorillas and elephants, and these turned out to be my 2 main study species. But I started with gorillas, not because I was particularly well qualified to do so. I wrote to Dian Fossey, having heard that things were often breaking at Karasoke. At university as an undergraduate, I organized speakers for the Biology Society. So just as this lecture series, if you're doing that job, it's really nice because you look through the literature and think, oh, there's an interesting study. I'll write to that person and invite them to speak. And they come and they give a talk. And in that instance, Sandy Harcourt, who has just done his PhD fieldwork and was writing up his dissertation at Cambridge, came and talked about his work with gorillas. And I put him up in my flat overnight, and I picked his brain, and I got Dian Fossey's address. And anyway, I wrote to Dian and said, my academic tutors don't rate me very highly, but I love nature, and if I can help, if I can mend the roof or make the tea, I'd be happy to do so. And I mentioned the mending the roof because Sandy had said this is a remote research center. When something breaks, it stays broken. So if you have any aptitude for fixing things, you should mention it. And I am something of a compulsive fixer. So I'm sure that Dian thought, oh, here's someone who can do the odd jobs around camp. And that's how in 1976, I found myself sitting amongst a family of gorillas, taking notes, which was the then standard practice. Notice the distance between me and the gorillas is much less than we aim for today. There was little concern for disease transmission in those days. We were sort of in self-imposed quarantine, living in the mountains for months on end and not seeing many other humans. And I guess it wasn't an issue as much then. Of course, since the COVID pandemic, the distance has been increased. It used to be 7 meters that we tried to maintain, and now it's 10 meters. Mask wearing is now mandatory in all ape research and tourism sites. So just bear in mind that these are historical photos, and when you see close contact, it is what was happening then 4.5 decades ago and isn't what's happening today. Now, the story of Dian Fossey and her book Gorillas in the Mist famously was made into a movie starring Sigourney Weaver in the title role. And for many people, that was their introduction to primatology. You know, people who wouldn't necessarily sit and watch a documentary, and there hadn't been many documentaries about Dian at that time, only a couple really. So she wasn't the world famous primatologist she became. And of course, her life was ended tragically when she was murdered in Christmas 1985. And that was just before the producers of this film were coming to Rwanda to talk to her about the film. And they were literally on the way, and they heard that the person they were going to meet had just been murdered. So it was a horrible story, and it became part of the movie. And the movie itself made history because for the first time, there were 2 studios, Warner Brothers and Universal, wanted to make a film about Gorillas in the Mist, about Dian Fossey's life. And for the first time in Hollywood history, they worked together. Extraordinary. They had 2 directors, 2 producers. They managed to whittle it down to 1 actress to play the title role, which is good. And it is a very powerful film. It is a drama, not a documentary, but there are elements in there which are very accurate in their presentation of field work. There are other elements which are not. And the scene where Diane is touching the gorillas, well, there was one scene where a silverback did strut by her and she cowered appropriately, and that was real. It wasn't acting. But there are other scenes where people in gorilla suits were doing the action to get the necessary close-up shots. The real story of Gorillas in the Mist, you should read the book if you haven't. It is an extraordinary story because this woman who was sort of 36 when she came to Rwanda, she wasn't a new graduate. She'd been working as a physiotherapist in a children's hospital, occupational therapist in Louisville, Kentucky, and saved up and borrowed money to go on a safari in the early 60s, and was so entranced by what she'd glimpsed in the Virungas when the filmmaker Alan Root helped her see gorillas, that she convinced the late great Louis Leakey to take her on as his next study of great apes. He'd already initiated Jane Goodall's study of chimpanzees at Gombe in 1960, and in 1967 Diane Fossey began her work. I got there in 1976, so nearly 10 years later, and it was not a happy time for Karisoki because they were still poaching, and during the time that I was there, some of our study animals were killed by poachers, not for traditional purposes, but because foreigners would pay good money for a gorilla skull or a baby gorilla. And those are the two main reasons: skulls and hands to sell from gorillas that have been killed, and baby gorillas to sell if they were captured alive. And these two photographs illustrate how Diane responded to that. She had learned how to win the trust of wild gorillas. So the picture on the right shows Poppy, then an infant of about 18 months, investigating Diane in a way which now we do not encourage and try to avoid, because obviously droplet infection and even aerosol infection at that proximity is a possibility, and gorillas are susceptible to the same viruses and other pathogens as we are. But at the time, that was an extraordinary situation, because just sitting a few yards away were the mother and father of Poppy, who didn't mind that their child was approaching a human. That was the level of trust that Diane had won over 10 years. So these gorillas were seeing some humans as friendly, but other humans in the forest had a very different agenda. And the other picture shows Diane's response to that. She hired additional trackers to not track the gorillas, but to track poachers and cut snares. And eventually she got them to work with the park guards, whose job it was to do that, but who were not motivated or paid or trained or equipped to do that. And it was a turbulent time, with the loss of some of our study animals, the setting of snares for antelope that would sometimes maim or injure young gorillas. And in the midst of all that, film crews coming to film, one of which was the BBC. Then David Attenborough, now Sir David Attenborough, turned up in January 1978, literally days after the death of the gorilla whose portrait is behind me in my office. That's Digit. Digit was killed by poachers, decapitated, hands and cut off and body mutilated in what must have been a very dramatic scene. And while he was fighting off the poachers as the young male, the peripheral male, dealing with the external threat, the lead silverback, the alpha male, Uncle Bert, and his females and young fled. So in human terms, Digit gave his life so that his family would survive. And that was the most dramatic thing. It was a sort of a turning point in gorilla conservation. And just a few days later, David Attenborough turned up to make a 7-minute sequence on the use of the opposable thumb for his landmark series, Life on Earth, which I think you can still find online. You can certainly find this sequence because it has become television history. It's one of the most watched and most loved sequences. And no one was expecting Pablo, then a juvenile, to come and sit on our esteemed presenter. No one was expecting Puck, the gorilla sitting behind Pablo, to lean forward, take hold of his head and look into his eyes upside down. And the producer and the cameraman are thinking, You know, a gorilla's got the head of our presenter. We haven't finished the series yet. But Puck was very polite and put David's head back onto his shoulders. And Pablo just played, and Poppy came and undid his shoelace. And it was a wonderful sequence. And it wasn't planned to be filmed, because David was trying to talk about the importance of the opposable thumb in primate evolution, how it gives you that manipulative grasp. And I've often said to him, well, you should have talked about the fact that Poppy is using her opposable thumb to undo your shoelaces, David. Come on. Anyway, it was a wonderful moment, and it has gone down in history. And yet this was 10 days after Digit had been killed and decapitated. So that there's highs and lows of field work are extraordinary. And as a scientist, you're supposed to remain objective. Study animal killed by poachers. Is that what you do? Or do you get involved? If you see it about to happen, do you step forward and say, stop, and hope that the poachers run away and don't attack you? It puts you into very difficult situations when your study animals are the subject of someone else's route out of poverty. Because it's often a poverty-stricken villager who's either supplying an outside market with a gorilla skull or hands or a baby, or just wants some meat if they're of a culture that eat gorillas. People in Rwanda don't eat gorillas, so they don't face that threat. But Western lowland gorillas and cross-river gorillas and some eastern lowland gorillas do live alongside people who see them as not just meat, but special meat. We'll come on to that later. So for those who aren't familiar with the Veronica Volcanoes, here's an image that shows you the two gorilla habitats. And I think you can see my cursor. So you've got the Virunga Massif here, and you've got Bwindi, which does actually extend over into the Sarambwe Reserve. So both are transboundary pockets of forest, surrounded by human habitation, except for this little link here, which goes on, because the Virunga National Park goes all the way up to the Ruwenzori's off this map. But only this bit is gorilla habitat. Oh, and a little bit Mount Chiabarimu, where eastern lowland gorillas live. So fragmented, isolated pockets of forest in which there are small populations. The numbers on this map are rather out of date. Now the combined population of these two areas of forest is just over 1,000. Just over 1,000. Mountain gorillas are back into four figures. And when I started, they were around 250, 280, and on a downward trajectory. So the last census that I took part in 1981, it was 242 counted, and probably allowing for a few that we might have missed, around 250 in the Virungas, and we'd never counted Bwindi. But gradually the numbers are picking up. What an amazing success story. Mountain gorillas have more at the end of each year than they had at the beginning of each year. They are the only species of great ape, apart from humans, whose numbers are increasing year on year. And that's as a result of the intensive conservation work that has continued through genocide and war and civil unrest. And right now in the DRC, there are armed militias occupying gorilla habitat with whatever their political or economic objectives are. Sometimes they're just bandits, sometimes they have political objectives. And that's where you do mountain gorilla conservation. You can't wait till it's peaceful and come and see what's happened. You have to be there throughout. And that has led to some extraordinary experiences for colleagues of all nationalities who have worked there, but most especially for the Rwandan and Ugandan and Congolese conservationists, for whom that's their working environment. And still they do it. They are inspirations to the rest of us, because they just live there and carry on protecting the habitat and the gorillas. Now, the first gorilla I met, the first gorilla on the screen when I started my lecture and couldn't get the slides to advance, was Titus. And Titus was one of the gorillas who was behind David Attenborough when he did his "There is more meaning and mutual understanding in exchanging a glance with a gorilla than any other animal I know." And he was doing that off the cuff. I'm sure he'd thought it through, but he didn't have a script or an auto cue. He was just speaking from the heart. And while he said that, behind him, Titus and Quayle were peering at the camera, and he turns around and says, because he was reassuring the gorillas with a contact call that Diane had started to use to reassure the gorillas when habituating them. And whenever it seemed appropriate, you would just let the gorillas know that you were there and everything was fine. And as a result of that winning of the trust of these free-living wild gorillas with no persuasion on our part to come to us, no provisioning, Diane felt that Jane's method of putting out bananas to bring the chimps to camp so she could observe them would change their behavior. So she was proud not to provision the gorillas, but simply to find them each day and observe them. And we learned about their daily routine. They get up in the morning and feed, and each item of food is carefully selected and prepared, different preparation for each species of plant. This is Titus eating thistles. He stripped off the foliage from the midrib of each leaf, folded them over to tuck most of the spines away, and then he's biting through that wodge of vegetation, twisting the wrist with each mouthful. Here, an adult female is plucking sedge flowers. Now, they also eat the base of the leaves of sedge, but the flowers, when you get a nice little bunch of flowers, you're a gorilla, you pop it in your mouth. And there are many edible flowers, as some of you may know. And it's always fun if you're in a restaurant and you spot an edible flower to start plucking the flower and eating them, maybe making a few gorilla contentment while you're doing it. And that clip ended on the baby gorilla, who of course is sitting in his mum's lap, being showered by bits of the inedible parts of plants. It must be like living under the waste disposal chute of a vegetarian kitchen, as bits of peel and root and so on, that the bits that the mother doesn't want to eat are showering down. And young gorillas, of course, are curious and will pick up bits of the food plant and chew them and get the taste. And they're sitting observing their mother. And what they're doing, they're learning botany, how to identify the food plants from the other species, and culinary techniques, how to prepare the edible part of each plant and dispose of the inedible part. And you can learn a lot, obviously, by looking at gorilla dung. Even if they're unhabituated and you can't get close to observe them, you can examine dung. And I was particularly interested in the parasites of gorillas, so I spent a lot of time sifting through kilo after kilo of gorilla dung. Not always with as interesting seeds in as this. The large round seeds are Pygeum, a species sometimes called the African plum or African cherry, Pygeum africana, and it is seed dispersed by gorillas, but also by Ruwenzori turcos. The seeds can be swallowed by larger birds. And on the right of the picture, you can see a blackberry. Blackberries are a favorite fruit of gorillas. They don't always wait for them to go black. And you can see that it's a green blackberry that is not ripe. But when they're sitting in front of a thicket, plucking blackberries, they eat the black ones, the red ones, the green ones, they all go down. And the ones that don't get digested, and of course the seeds are the ones that do get digested, come out in the dung and are deposited in a little package of fertilizer, because of course the dung rots down to manure and miles from the parent plant. And that role of seed dispersal agent is important. It's also important on a personal level that when you study animals that are so like yourself, that you cannot help but care about them. We are a social species. We have empathy. I think gorillas also have empathy, and they form friendships. This is Pablo 10 years after I first met him, where he'd grown up into a splendid young silverback, not yet with any responsibilities. So he's like a silverback without portfolio. He was hanging around on the edge of the group. He's got the muscles and the bulk. He's lost the hair on his chest, so his chest beat is coming on. It's starting to sound like a silverback, but he hasn't got any females and he hasn't yet got any responsibilities. And he hadn't seen me for some years, so he came over and sat next to me and clearly recognized me from his childhood, when he used to be the bane of my existence. When I was trying to film the gorillas, he would steal cans of film and items to play with. And he came over and sat and reached around and started to invite me to sort of a play tussle. And that's against the rules. A historical photograph, I'm not suggesting anyone tries to emulate this. I didn't ask for this to happen, but because I was interested in gorilla parasites, this is my first opportunity to groom a silverback, because normally they're a bit more standoffish. They don't come and sit next to you. So I'm grooming his shoulder. I didn't find any lice because he was a very well-groomed young silverback. He's got friends to keep the lice population down. But gorillas have a species of louse that is the only other species in the genus Thyrus, and Thyrus pubis, the human pubic louse, and Thyrus gorillae, the gorilla louse are closely related species. What does that tell us about the evolution of humans and gorillas? That we have not just pediculus, the head louse, that chimpanzees have an equivalent species of, but gorillas have an equivalent species of louse evolved to cope with thick, widely spaced hairs, which covers human pubic hair and armpit hair, and gorilla pubic and armpit hair. That's where they tend to congregate the most. So lots of lessons to learn, but in this instance, it was just wonderful that he recognized me and came over and said hello, but not to be, to attempt to be emulated. And in fact, you can't emulate that because it was at the gorilla's instigation, and I put his hand back. Pablo, no, that's against the rules. So Diane's response to being surrounded by illegal activities in Africa's first national park, created in 1925 by the Belgian colonial authorities, was to hire men and send them out on patrols and cut snares. And these were unofficial patrols, and we had no authority to arrest people. They might make a citizen's arrest. I was a visiting researcher. So kind of breaking the rules to enforce the law. It doesn't sound like a good strategy. And indeed, after the death of Digit and David Attenborough taking word of that killing back to London, to what was then the Fauna Preservation Society, now Fauna and Flora International, an appeal was launched. And then other organizations joined, and a coalition was formed called the Mountain Gorilla Project, which later evolved into the IGCP, the International Gorilla Conservation Program. Meanwhile, Diane was just paying local guys to go out and cut snares and try to capture poachers. And when the rangers turned up, the park guards, they would work together. If they didn't turn up, our men went out. So it was like being a backstop until such time as all the money that was raised off the killing of Digit and then Uncle Bert, and Macho and other members of our study groups raised funds that could properly equip and train the park guards. Now it is a totally different situation. I think the Volcanoes National Park in Rwanda, the Virunga National Park in Congo, and Mugahinga and Bwindi in Uganda are among the best protected and the best run national parks in the world. But then it was very, make it up as you go along, try and hold back the forces that are destroying the species and the habitat until such time as a more orderly and organized protection system could be introduced. And although the murder of Diane Fossey has not been solved, she died effectively in action. And she was killed in her cabin, but as a result of her activities. And whether you approve or disapprove of the way Diane responded to that crisis, she has for many people served as an example of someone who's prepared to dedicate their life and in the end give their life to conservation. And sadly, I have so many colleagues who have done the same, who have died in the field or as a result of the political turmoil that surrounds some of these areas during the genocide. It is not in that sense a happy place, and yet it is such a wonderful place. If you have time, at the end of this talk, we'll look at a website called Vico Tourism, and you can take a tour to Diane's tomb in virtual reality and sit there and contemplate that beautiful spot where she's buried. When Diane was killed, many people feared that would be it for mountain gorillas. They've lost their champion. But fortunately, Diane had inspired so many people, sometimes in a positive way, people who wanted to emulate her courage, sometimes in a she's doing it all wrong, we can do it better way. But she blew the whistle, and out of that grew gorilla tourism and better organized conservation and sharing of revenues with local communities, so that local people have a stake in the conservation of the mountain gorillas. And as I mentioned earlier, their numbers are now increasing every year, and thousands of people every year normally, when there isn't a pandemic or there isn't a civil war or a genocide. It has proved to be a very resilient form of tourism because you don't need many people. And so many people have been inspired by seeing documentaries about gorillas that they want to go and do a David Attenborough and sit near the gorillas and take their photographs, that even in times of terrible strife of the surrounding human communities, there are a few people who are prepared to go and pay the money to go and see the gorillas. And in Rwanda, that money is now $1,500 In Uganda and DRC, it's less, but it's still a substantial amount of money. And the result of that is that the gorilla groups that are habituated and visited by either researchers or tourists, or now both, have more babies and a higher infant survival rate than the wild gorillas that still flee from people. And part of the reason for that is the gorilla doctors, the team of vets who will intervene if a gorilla infant gets caught in a snare. In the habituated groups, it's seen. And they have now got methods with, again, incredibly courageous rangers who stand between the silverback and the injured animal so that the vet can dart it and remove the snare and give it some antibiotics and then release it. It's not taken out of the forest. It has a much better chance of survival, just recuperating naturally. So here you see a wonderful scene of a new infant, and the older juvenile is now displaced from the maternal nest, having to cope with a sibling and all the sibling rivalry that we're used to in human families, you see play out in gorilla families. And that, those signs of success, more babies being born, more babies surviving to adulthood, is wonderful, but the limited size of the park is a real constraint to recovering the gorilla numbers to what they were before the park was reduced in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. So Rwanda has taken this extraordinary decision. The most densely populated country in Africa has decided to restore some of the park that was taken to natural habitat. And there's the plan, which is wonderful. But the fact is that if those areas are occupied by gorillas and there's room for more families, the success of the tourism means that that land will earn more money than it could earn growing crops. So it is an extraordinary success story. That ain't the case for the other apes, and indeed most other primates are declining in numbers. So in 1996, I convened a meeting of NGOs that care about primates, the Gorilla Organization, the Orangutan Foundation, the IPPL, International Primate Protection League, and many others, Born Free Foundation, around a table in the Royal Geographical Society in London. And we agreed we should work together in a sort of loose coalition. And we wondered what we might call ourselves. This grew out of the UK Elephant Group, which had coordinated efforts to get the ivory trade banned, and UK Ape Group, and Ape Alliance was the name that was chosen, and that's still the website. We were gifted that website, 4apes.com, and if you go there, you'll find a link to all the now nearly 100 organizations that are in the alliance, all working in their own way for apes and occasionally collaborating in shared campaigns and issues. So it's rather sad. What are the threats facing apes? Bushmeat is one of them. In most of the countries where primates live naturally, they are seen by traditional hunters as another prey item. And as more and more people live in cities, but have their cultural values informed by either their childhood or their grandparents' childhood in a village where they eat wild meat, this is normal. This is a bushmeat market in Pointe Noire in Congo, Brazzaville. And the traders will say, well, these are all legally traded species. And there is a big sign put up by the Jane Goodall Institute saying that it's illegal to buy or sell or kill apes or elephants or other protected species. A few days after I spoke to the bushmeat traders there was an expose of how many gorillas per week were passing through that market under the counter. So the Ape Alliance produced a significant report called African Bushmeat Trade, Recipe for Extinction. And then nearly 10 years later, a second report, Recipe for Survival. And you can find those on the 4apes.com website. And bushmeat, if you're a primatologist and it's your study animals that have been killed, is clearly a horrible thing. But when you meet the hunters and the families, this lady is married to a bushmeat hunter. The future of her child depends on how many animals he kills. And I wouldn't want that child not to have shoes and not to be able to pay school fees. So how do you employ a bushmeat hunter? Well, if you're doing research and there isn't an established research center, you can transform the history of that village by hiring the hunters. So leave your weapon behind, we'll go into the forest. And they won't like that. I've done that. And this guy, the husband of this lady, didn't want to leave his gun behind. I said, but I'm going to pay you to take me into the forest. We're going to look for gorillas and chimpanzees, and we're not going to kill them. And that's his security. If you're walking in a forest and there are big, dangerous wild animals, having a gun is your security, unless you have the knowledge of those animals' behavior and can behave in a way that reduces their fear of you. And so you can influence the minds of hunters and see that there is another way of making a living from wildlife by taking researchers or tourists out to see them, as was the case here. Not that it grew into a project, but it could. And you're opening people's minds to that possibility. Otherwise, it's the traditional uses. And with gorillas in particular, and chimpanzees, people who live in their habitat know that they're really clever animals and that gorillas are really powerful animals. And there is a belief that if you eat or use bits of their anatomy, you can gain some of those properties. So you eat gorilla meat, and that's mainly for big, powerful men. You get something of the strength of the gorilla. You use gorilla hands like this. The reason this hand on the left is missing some fingers is that someone has bought them to make a charm to make themselves or their child better. And if your child is sick and your local medicine provider says, go to the market, buy a gorilla finger. If it's a youth, he might say, grind it, burn it black, grind it into a powder, and then cut the boy's arm and rub it in. And I've heard the phrase used, you're vaccinating the child with the power of the gorilla. And if you believe that, and that's what you're told to do by the person that you turn to for medical advice, that's what you'll do. Unless you have an alternative person saying, actually, no, take this aspirin or take this, and your child will get better. So improved medical health is an important part of stopping people using these traditional remedies. And for people like that, if they've never seen a gorilla using their hand, never seen how curious other gorillas are about what one gorilla is eating. These are in a sanctuary in Cameroon. And it's fascinating to watch these interactions without the foliage obscuring it. And we hope one day these gorillas in Cameroon will find their way back into, be reintroduced to natural habitat. But at the moment, you can get some really good insights into gorilla behavior in a semi-natural setting where you can actually see what's going on. And that is, of course, an important educational tool, because school parties come into Limbe and other sanctuaries. There's a Pan-African Sanctuaries Alliance, PASA, which has raised the standards of about, I think now 22 primate sanctuaries across Africa to both care for the animals confiscated from the illegal wildlife trade and rescued from the bushmeat trade, and where possible return them to the wild, and where not possible use them as educational tools. And the t-shirt this child is wearing, wouldn't no chop this kind bush beef for them go finish all small time. You can work out what that means if you speak English. It's pidgin English saying don't kill these kind of animals because they're going to be extinct. They'll be finished in a very short time. How do you reach out to people and change opinion? That's very much what conservation is about. And when I tried this before this talk, this film played, and it is of Jeremy, a Cameroonian footballer who plays for clubs in the UK and is seen as a kind of a national hero because he's made it out into, he's a star. And he kindly did a little public service ad, which isn't playing, but you can find it on the Ape Alliance website under the bushmeat section. Because we need to convince people that it's in their own interests not to kill the wildlife, certainly not to kill it unsustainably. And with apes in particular and elephants, their reproductive cycle is so slow that they cannot stand even a low level of hunting. You kill 1 or 2% of a slowly reproducing ape species, and you'll see their population decline. 1 or 2% a year is enough to see that population decline. But often it's species that it's legal to hunt. This is a duiker killed by someone who's settled on the side of a road. And that picture encapsulates a lot of the problems that are facing what used to be remote areas where there wasn't access to market. So you couldn't, as a hunter, get the animals you killed to make money in the city. But you've got thousands of people living in a city who want to buy meat that is part of their cultural background. So what happens? You put a road through, and you're taking out logs, and the drivers of these trucks know that if they buy this for $50 on the side of the road, they can sell it in town for $100, and they provide the transport. And it's hard not to do that. I saw Carl Mann interviewed a driver, and he said, well, if you were walking along and you saw a $50 bill on the floor, you'd pick it up. Essentially, it's easy money. I've got wheels, I'm going to town. There's somebody who can only get a small price here because there are other hunters with antelope to sell. But if that antelope gets to town, it's a red duiker forest species, and one of the species that possibly can cope with and a blue duikers are particularly good at coping with the level of hunting that you get. But most of the larger species are quickly wiped out, and that happens because human influence is spreading into the remote areas. The Congo Basin that used to need a major expedition to cross is becoming divided up by roads and railways and pipelines. And that little animation was part of a report that GRASP produced. GRASP is a United Nations Great Ape Survival Partnership. Operated, the Secretariat is shared by UNEP and UNESCO, but much of the planning is done in UNEP in Nairobi. And in 2002, they did this report, Great Apes, The Road Ahead. You can find it online. The animation just shows how ape habitat is being impacted by human infrastructural development. And once you've built a road, ribbon development follows. People cleared on either side of the road, and a narrow road suddenly becomes a strip, perhaps 1 or 2 kilometers wide, of agriculture. And apes that used to just live there are now crop raiding pests and will be killed if they raid plantations. So that was the prediction. By 2030, only 10% of great ape habitats will remain free of those impacts. In Southeast Asia, only 1%. And in fact, 5 years after that, they redid the calculations for Southeast Asia and decided it would be by 2020. And pretty much we're on target. We are opening up ape habitat to human activities. And who's to blame? Is it the man with a chainsaw? I mean, he's got a skill. He can feed his family. And this particular man with a chainsaw was actually clearing a tree that had fallen over the road, keeping open those channels to get the products of the rainforest to the cities and to ports so that they can then be taken to the rest of the world. And I would say, well, it's not the man with the chainsaw that is at fault. It's the man who pays the wages of the chainsaw. And that's essentially us, because we in the developed world are buying the paper, the palm oil, the other products, the rubber that lead to deforestation. And whilst there has been a huge push in recent years to end deforestation, it hasn't stopped, which is scary, because we're getting to the point now where these globally important ecosystems are so fragmented that the function they provide in maintaining the health of the biosphere is being eroded away. And we are facing ecosystem collapse on top of the changes being wrought by climate change. So we're in a very critical period of our evolution and of our planet's evolution. You must have read we're now in the beginning of the 6th mass extinction. But unlike previous mass extinctions, which were asteroids or volcanic eruptions, this is a sentient being which is causing it. And you'd think, having called ourselves Homo sapiens, we might actually use that sapient ability to change that course of events. And that's why IPBES are meeting in Bonn now. That's why the CBD, which should have met in 2020, and now instead of meeting in China, is meeting in Canada later this year to develop a policy framework which would prevent this from happening. And while that's happening at the policy level, at the highest level of government and international negotiations, people on the ground are just struggling to get by. And one of the ways they can get by is to turn trees and bushes into charcoal and then plonk a bag on the side of the road. The people who do that haven't got transport, but people driving by have. So just like the bushmeat, if wheels are going by, the driver thinks, oh, bag of charcoal. I could use that for myself, or I can take it into town and sell it for twice what I buy it for here because I'm providing the transport. And all over Africa, that's happening. In my other study site, we're moving on now from gorillas to elephants, just briefly, I'll get back to primates shortly. This is on Mount Elgin, where a few years ago, I was out with a team of rangers and we were finding charcoal kilns in the forest. This pile of earth was to sort of damp down the flames so that the wood isn't consumed, it's just turned into charcoal. And what the rangers have to do is to open that up and let the wood burn so that the people who made the charcoal kiln don't profit from it. But it's such a waste because this is Elgon teak. It's a tropical hardwood. If this was more logical, the poachers, the illegal woodcutters, would be cutting down the teak and selling it as hardwood. But that's not what they're being asked to do. They're being asked to make charcoal because that's what the demand is. So valuable hardwoods are being turned into charcoal. I mean, it's just ludicrous. But those gangs of workers are faced with elephants and they chase them away. And sometimes the elephants are killed for ivory, not so much for meat in Kenya, but sometimes also for meat. The Elgon elephants, though, which are the ones that I studied starting in 1980, are unusual in that most of them don't have very big tusks, and yet they're normal African elephants. They're not even forest elephants, I learned after I first got there. They're savanna elephants that live in forests, so forest-dwelling elephants. But the reason they've got short, stumpy little tusks is that these are the only salt mining elephants in the world that go deep underground into caves. How extraordinary. Look at this mother keeping her trunk on her calf so it doesn't get lost in the dark. This is taken with a flash with elephants that had become habituated to my presence, observing them with a torchlight and taking photographs. But seeing elephants deep underground, hearing them rumble, feeling them rumble, because elephants speak to each other using infrasound, which travels for miles through the forest. And if you're not an elephant, you probably don't hear it because you haven't got the capability to hear that frequency of sound. But if you're in a cave and that sound is reverberating around, you feel it with your skin. Just talking about it gives me goosebumps because that memory is so sharp of, whoa, I am vibrating to elephant rumbles in a cave 160 meters underground in total darkness. So it's wonderful to see phenomena like this and to study them and the dependence of the elephants on the sodium ions in the mineral-rich layer of rock, and the fact that this normal elephant behavior of geophagy, not just elephants, I've photographed black and white colobus monkeys in the same cave chewing a rock because they're foliivores, and these plants on top of the mountain are growing in soils that have been leached by the rainfall that the mountain generates, so they're low in sodium salts, and we all need our dose of sodium ions. We like to put salt on our food, and the reason that tastes good is because we've evolved to say, yes, eat that, your body needs that. This isn't sodium chloride, so it doesn't taste salty to the tongue, but it's sodium sulfate, which once it's digested, it produces sodium ions so that your physiology gets what it needs and the elephants feel better. But how extraordinary to have an African elephant 150 meters underground, tusking in darkness, feeling the surface of the rock for bumps, leaning on the point of the tusk. Imagine 3 or 4 tons of elephant on a point that size. And there's a huge amount of pressure. That's why the rock here is covered in stripes, which are tuskings, where tusks have scraped across the surface. It's just amazing. So I encourage you to go to the Vico Tourism website and click on the salt mining elephants and take the virtual tour and learn about this. It doesn't always go as smoothly as that last picture where the young elephant in the cave tolerated me taking photographs in the dark. This was a crash course in conservation when a very stroppy elephant, not this one, this was a really nice encounter with a slightly nervous but not more curious than frightened elephant. You do have to be careful doing field work, especially if you're in elephant habitat, because elephants, as you will know, are very large, and that makes them very heavy, and it's really not a good idea to get under their feet. Sadly, though, far more elephants are killed by people than people are killed by elephants. I mean, it's sad in both cases, and in both species, the surviving members of a family mourn the loss of the individual who's died. This is the remains of an adult male elephant called Big Tembo. For those who know Swahili, it's not a very imaginative name, but it's what the rangers called him because he was the biggest. And maybe he didn't do so much mining. He picked up rock off the floor and didn't do the tusking. So his tusks had grown quite big, and as a result of which he was killed by ivory poachers. And the irony is he was killed just days after China closed its ivory markets. So we've been campaigning since 1989, or since before 1989, but 1989 is when CITES listed African elephants on Appendix 1, which prevents international trade for primarily commercial purposes. But the illegal trade has continued, and every time there's some limited legalized sale of ivory, it opens the floodgates to poachers who think, oh, good, back in business. And Big Timber was killed, and these are his remains. And these men who I'm with, David Kiparenge, who was actually born in Kitsum Cave when it was not a national park and people lived there, and has spent his life in conservation. He was in tears, and other members of the team at an elephant they had been monitoring for years, killed like this. And it's so sad that it was just at the tail end of the ivory trade, but it's still happening. Elephants are still being killed by poachers. And everyone thinks, oh, the poor elephants, and oh, the poor members of the family who are grieving the loss of that member of their community. Not so many think, oh, the poor forest. Big Timber was probably 45. So he probably had 15 years of life. Big Timber would have been producing roughly 1 metric ton of dung every week, 52 weeks a year, spreading it around the forest. And that dung, when he's been feeding on fruit, will be full of seeds. This is actually not on Mount Elgon. This is in northern Congo, near the border with CAR and Central African Republic and Gabon. And what you see is seed dispersal. These are seedlings. And we didn't really understand the ins and outs of this process, except that elephants disperse more seeds, more individual seeds of more species, and take them further than any other animal. So they are really important in the maintaining the health of the forest. But most of these seedlings, they're dispersing thousands of seeds every week. Most of them are not going to grow into mighty trees, or else there wouldn't be any room in the forest. They, of course, feed the antelope. The animals that feed at ground level are eating these small seedlings. A few of them will survive to adulthood, but most of them won't. And all the animals that are feeding on those seeds, including elephants, when these get big enough for an elephant to eat, they'll eat the seedlings, the saplings, and produce dung. And the dung is fertilizing the soils, and the competition for nutrients in a rainforest is intense. So when a tree falls like this log here, very quickly it's broken down by wood-boring beetles and fungi, and the nutrients are returned. And rainforest soil is very poor quality soil because there's so much demand for the nutrients, nothing stays there long. So these dollops of fertilizer are seized upon, metaphorically speaking, figuratively speaking, by the big trees that are already established, and they get bigger. We'll come to that later. So apes, elephants, and all the other species have a role to play in the ecology. They're big, they're impressive. This is not a charging silverback, this is a yawning silverback. And you can see that one of his canine teeth is missing, because in fights with other silverbacks, sometimes they slash with their teeth and snap off their canine tooth. It's really exciting to watch this kind of behavior. But their response to a threat, to stand up and go, wah, very loudly, if that threat is someone with a projectile, be it a spear or a bow and arrow or a gun, that's just the wrong threat. It's like a hedgehog rolling up in the face of oncoming traffic. It works for predators. You've got prickles. Doesn't work for lorries. You're killed. So gorillas, if you have a gun and enough courage to face a charging gorilla and use the gun, are easy to kill. And if there's a demand for their meat, because officers in the army or chiefs in villages want to impress their friends and invite them round for a meal of gorilla meat, which happens, then silverbacks will be killed. And when there's a breakdown in law and order, as happens when there's a civil war, this was during the Congo's civil war, the Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire, then even known named gorillas are killed by poachers. And there's a great fear, if you habituate a gorilla for research or tourism, you are lowering his or her guard. Next time a poacher comes, they won't be so afraid and they're more likely to die. So you cannot habituate animals unless you can guarantee their safety. And that means that some populations of gorillas have not been habituated. Cross-river gorillas, the most endangered subspecies of gorilla, have not been habituated. The people studying them follow them the day after. And they're using camera traps and dung analysis and studying their nests, but they don't want to habituate them until all the hunting communities have come on side to conservation, and they won't be in danger, because you don't want to lower their guard. No one predicts that a civil war is going to break out and that there will be a breakdown in law and order, and that militias will hire hunters to feed the troops. and kill all the large mammals. That's what happened in Cohousie-Biega National Park. And what can NGOs do? They can help provide vehicles. They don't provide the weapons. That's the government's job. But you're helping people effectively defend nature. And every year, I'm a trustee of the Thin Green Line, which is a charity that helps rangers and helps the widows and orphans of rangers killed in the line of duty. It's a very precarious job, and literally hundreds are killed in the line of duty, giving their life to protect nature, just as effectively Diane Fossey and so many other foreign researchers and conservationists have done. And is it enough that NGOs will have a fundraising campaign and raise a few tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars and put it into conservation, when what you're pushing back against is big industry that wants to build a pipeline or a road and extract the timber or the minerals, and they're prepared to spend billions of dollars to prospect Africa to find places to put a mine, because they'll know they'll make many more billions of dollars from extracting from that mine. And there's no pushback against that. But at least there wasn't. We'll come to that in a minute. There's some good news to this bleak story. Unfortunately, we were all implicated in the death of some of those gorillas. These are teenage lads down a mine, mining not for mineral salts to eat, but mineral salts to be made into mobile phones and laptops. We are talking to each other across continents because of tantalum capacitors. Tantalum is a heavy metal. It's heavier than lead. So when you find a rock which is tantalum ore, you think, whoa, that's surprisingly heavy. And the people in Eastern DRC were surprised to find that foreigners with briefcases full of dollars would come and buy bags of these heavy rocks. Okay, let's go and find heavy rocks. And they're digging holes and eventually making mines with no knowledge of pit props and mining safety. So a couple of lads, flashlight strapped to the head with a bit of material, lump hammer and chisel, chipping away for hour after hour after hour underground. These guys said they were doing it in their summer holidays to earn a bit of money. And I believe them. This was in a mine that was safe for me to visit. Other mines that are in occupied territory with militias, people are forced to work down the mines. Terrorism is used to terrify villagers, to provide labor, to dig out the minerals, but it all gets into our mobile phones, because despite the fact that phone manufacturers and computer manufacturers are among the wealthiest businesses in the world, they haven't sorted their supply chain. And there is no certification system that can reliably say, I know the tantalum in my phone has not come from child labor or forced child labor. I don't mind kids earning money for pocket money on their summer holidays, but this is organized crime of the worst kind, involving rape and murder and child labor and all kinds of human rights abuses exercised by criminal gangs who somehow get their bags of minerals, not just tantalum, also tin and wolframite, and we're buying it. And we're not taking care, which is why UNEP, GRASP, and Interpol produce this report. Again, you can find it online, Last Stand of the Gorilla, Environmental Crime and Conflict, because the crime is feeding the conflict. Criminals don't care if their purchase of minerals leads to arms purchases, which leads to further instability. It's probably easier for them to operate in that environment than it is in a well-ordered country where there's rule of law and the police are on side. So this is serious stuff. And it involves primatology, because the primates that we want to study are in this kind of habitat. In many parts of the world, civil unrest, civil wars affect conservation and research. And you have to say, well, who's to blame? And you see where the minerals and the timber is going. And it's going to Europe, Australia, and Far East, China. And then it's exported as products, especially to China. And the timber, which used to mostly go to Europe, is now going mostly to China. And China has this incredibly ambitious scheme called the Belton Road Initiative, which is building railways and roads and ports all over the world to effectively make it easy for raw materials to come to China's factories where they make stuff to provide gizmos for the world. Furniture and computers and what you name it, it's likely to be made in China with raw materials that have come from Africa or Latin America or Southeast Asia, and sadly not always responsibly sourced. Although China, as host to the next conference on Convention of Biodiversity, has a lot of political leverage to do the right thing. And they are cleaning up their act. Their current 5-year plan talks about creating an ecological civilization. That's the high-level policy. The guys driving the bulldozers, who are paid by the entrepreneurs, have not necessarily bought into that yet. So we have to persuade them. So this is back in Kahuzi-Biega National Park, where the gorillas have been killed. This is Muguruza, who just recently died of natural causes, but he lived a long life, eating Myrrianthus fruit. Myrrianthus fruit is eaten by people too. It's very tasty. It looks like a sort of mini pineapple and quite tangy, but tasty. We don't tend to swallow the seeds. Gorillas do, and chimpanzees do, and elephants do. And that's why when you look at their dung the next day, you'll find it's full of seeds, the next generation of Myrrianthus trees. At the launch of GRASP, the UN Great Ape Survival Partnership, or project as it started out, in 2001 in September, the Rwandan ambassador who attended the launch saw that video and said, I remember that fruit when I was a girl. She'd grown up near Nyungwe Forest, and she had that as part of her childhood. Oh yes, you find the Myrrianthus fruits, eat them. But not anymore, because the trees have all been cut down and there are no elephants and chimpanzees, and never were gorillas in Nyungwe, to disperse the seeds. So it's a living example of how our generation is seeing the last of certain things happening. These are cross-river gorilla droppings with seedlings growing out of it. I still haven't seen a cross-river gorilla. I've seen the camera trap footage, and I know they're there, and I've tracked them with the WCS trackers. And Nigeria is trying to protect these last, and Cameroon are trying to protect these last gorillas, but some members of the communities living around there are still on the poverty line and see a gorilla as potential meat. And they're not thinking that if I kill the gorilla, he won't spend the next 20, 30 years dispersing seeds for the trees of tomorrow. He's thinking, I need money now and food now. So how can we push back? Well, there was great excitement when the UN developed REDD, R-E-D-D, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation of forests. And the plus is supposed to represent the co-benefit, biodiversity and livelihoods and rainfall, etc. Can the carbon markets help protect forests? And the answer is, well, they could. And there was great optimism that this was to see a huge transfer of wealth from the wealthy north to the developing south in a way that protects rather than destroys forests. And in places it has worked, but it has been rife with corruption. Because once you start talking about billions of dollars, it attracts the attention of people who are really interested in billions of dollars and not necessarily interested in primates and their habitat. And that's the world we live in. We have to deal with that. And what can we do as citizens in the global north? We can demonstrate and persuade our politicians that this really is a matter. This is on a climate march in London. And orangutans are important because they are seed dispersal agents in Southeast Asian forests, or Borneo and Sumatra. Well, some forests, tiny fragments of forests of Borneo and Sumatra. And bees are important because, of course, they pollinate. And that sort of imagery is really good to persuade the general public that this matters. It's not just, the nice animals are going extinct, what a shame. It's the ecosystems that sustain us all are being destroyed. And just briefly touching on orangutans, I haven't studied orangutans, but I am a trustee of the Orangutan Foundation UK, and I have visited and made films about them. And you can do a virtual tour of Sumatran orangutan habitat on the Vico tourism site. And they are extraordinary animals, the largest arboreal animal on the planet, and yet they're losing their habitat. I visited the Tripa swamp on the northwest coast of Sumatra because I wanted to see this destruction in action. And it's a low-lying area, which, because it's peat swamp, it's illegal to convert to plantations. And yet, and this is in the little plane that flew us up to the nearby town, Mulabo, and looking out the window, you can see beautiful rivers meandering, a bit of rainforest, and then a grid of plantation. And these are drainage canals because they need to lower the water table to expose the peat, to plant the palms. And so when you get there, it's no forest. When that orangutan was a child, this was all forest. And what Indonesia and Malaysia have done in the past few decades is what we in Britain and most of Europe have done over the past few hundred years. It's taken us hundreds of years to convert a wooded island into an island of agriculture with hedges and copses. And that's what's happening in Borneo and Sumatra and Peninsular Malaysia, but in decades, not centuries, because we have the machinery to do it fast now. And this is replacing rich biodiverse habitat with what have been described as green deserts, single species plantations, in this case of oil palm, an African species, which is actually a food plant for African apes. But here, if orangutans feed them, they're seen as a crop pest, and they're often killed. And yet, GRASP commissioned this report, which looked at the economics of sustainable forest management in Sumatra and concluded that per unit area, you can make more money from the carbon markets and tourism than you can from cutting down the forest and growing palm oil and selling the timber. But different people would make that money. And the people who are making this money are not part of that solution. So how do you get the bad guys into the room and say, look, I know you want to make money, but this is how you do it more effectively, and we still have a forest with orangutans. And conveying that, the importance of that to people on the other side of the world who are funding it by their purchases of items like lipstick and ice cream and biscuits that contain palm oil, is difficult. That's why we did this virtual tour. This is me up in an orangutan's nest in a little pocket-sized patch of forest in Sumatra, looking out over the oil palm plantations. And the nest was built in this last remaining tree, and the adult male who built the nest would, as a child, have learned about his habitat and where the females live and where the fruit trees are during the long orangutan childhood of 8 years. And all that knowledge is now lost. It's irrelevant because he's clinging on in little pockets of forest, and his kids might well be entertaining people in circuses and shows in Southeast Asia, which tourists visit and think, what a giggle. Orangutans wearing clothes and doing daft things, or, oh, we can have our picture taken with the family and an orangutan, not realizing that the orangutan is forced to do this and leads a miserable life and doesn't have a future. Whereas he should have been spending the next 40 years dispersing seeds in a rainforest. So education is really important. And this question of stolen apes keeps coming up, and the CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, has not yet really grasped the importance of this, pun intended. So this is another report you can find online, Stolen Apes. Just look it up. I'm not going to go through it now. And look at global primate distribution, and you're familiar with it. And you're in the most northerly country that has indigenous primates. So you're very fortunate that you have, and that's why Japanese culture is so respectful of primates, very different from the Judeo-Christian attitude to other primates. But where there are primates, there are rainforests, and this is not an accident. And where there are rainforests, there is change. This is an interactive map produced by the UK Met Office, Meteorological Office, where you can see what the predictions are for the changes in temperatures around the world as average global temperatures rise, and the impact it has on rainfall. And what it shows is that where the tropical rainforests were, or still are going to become arid zones. So all our efforts to protect the species that live in rainforests, primates and non-primates, will be to no avail if we cannot prevent this rise in average global temperatures. The good news is, though, that those forests are so critical to the stability of the climate that if we protect them, that won't happen. Now, what you're looking at now, and I encourage you to look this up, not necessarily this one, but if you're making notes, write down T341. T341. This is T170 at the top of the screen. And that's actually, maybe you like this one because Japan's nearer the middle. This has Australia and the Pacific at the center of the map. The T341 version has a more conventional world map with Africa in the middle. But what you can see that on the left of the screen here, look, this is Africa, and look at the clock. So the days are ticking by about 1 a second. And that pulsing that you see that they've in orange represents rainfall or precipitation, snowfall in the north and south. So that the daily precipitation looks like a pump And in the Congo Basin, the pump sets up weather systems that you can watch travel west across the Atlantic to join the bigger pump of Amazonia, which then every day, rain, weather systems build up and they sweep up and get and water the Midwest in North America, where the Corn Belt is, and sweep across the Atlantic and water Britain and Europe. And some of the ones here will you see systems bouncing off the Andes and sweeping across and watering South Africa and Australia and New Zealand. It's extraordinary seeing the interconnectedness of global weather systems. The white represents water vapor, which of course is invisible. It only becomes visible when it condenses and you see the clouds. And the orange is the rainfall. And you can see how this daily rainfall in the three tropical forest blocks, Africa, Amazonia, and the Southeast Asian forested islands, are driving these weather systems that water our crops and fill our aquifers and power our hydroelectric schemes. So if you turn off the pumps, what's going to happen to global weather patterns? Well, we're seeing extreme weather events, changes in seasons. So we have to protect those pumps. They are integral to the future of life on Earth. I'm going to leave that now. It's fun to watch, but I'm supposed to be talking for an hour, and I think we've gone way beyond that. So let's try and wrap up. What can we do as individuals? Well, we can direct our work towards solutions. So if you're studying primates in Africa, talk to the local people, go into schools and talk to them, get them excited, because these kids hear the words of gorilla or in the local language or chimpanzee or monkey, and sometimes they see them as food, but they don't necessarily see them as gardeners of the forest that provide the rainfall that water their crops. And yet you can see rainfall patterns changing locally as forests are cleared. So what Rwanda is doing in restoring some of that forest to the Virungas is actually ensuring a better future for the agriculture in the surrounding area where so much of Rwanda's food is grown. It's common sense, but you have to have that ecological understanding. How can you get kids who live in a village where they don't even have electricity to understand this? Well, one method that we've been using through the Ape Alliance is pedal-powered cinemas. You can see up at the top of this hall, there's a guy on a bike. And he's one of the students who's pedaling to produce the electricity to show the screen. And most of these kids live so far from a town with the electricity that they've never seen moving images. So imagine you're going to school, and instead of just paper and books and a teacher and a blackboard, you're taken into the church hall. They've covered up the windows as far as they can with cloth, and you've got an impromptu cinema. And for the first time in your life, you're seeing moving images. And what you see is gorillas. And a good friend of mine, the director of the gorilla organization, was standing at the back of a hall of one of these presentations, and one of the mothers had come in to watch. And she said, that is my sister, looking at a gorilla breastfeeding her baby. And she's right. They are our cousins, and we should respect them. And when you see that penny dropping, it's not to do with, oh, you mustn't do this. It's just turning on the light, and people understand their similarity. And once again, they get the idea that, oh, wait a minute, gorillas disperse seeds, seeds grow into trees, trees produce rainfall and timber and fruit. We all benefit from those. Don't kill the gorillas. They're the gardeners of the forest. So getting that message across. People who live a long way from those ecosystems that do have electricity can use the internet. And that's why we developed this website, Vicotourism, the V for virtual. Go to it, vicotourism.org, click on the take a tour. This isn't live, so it doesn't work, but if you click on take a tour, you can choose a destination and you can go and visit primates in the wild. And I've said this before at primatological conferences, this is a great way of teaching primatologists to spend time in the field as if they're looking at behavior, and the lecturer can have counted the number of interactions or feeding food items consumed, and test the students who have watched the videos in a virtual setting and then done their homework. Most mainstream TV channels think natural history is an entertainment. They don't necessarily see it as an education. And if it gets difficult because it's depressing or involves subjects that are not popular, it's very hard to get those subjects on TV. It's changing a bit because of the pressure that the campaigns for climate change and biodiversity loss are having. But we've been trying for years to get a channel that is dedicated to the planet. And thanks to an American philanthropist called David Castleman, we now have that. It's called EcoFlix. Have a look, ecoflix.com. And you subscribe. It's a charity. So your subscription is actually a donation to charity, and it'll be used to rescue animals and protect habitat. But you can learn about behavior in this way. And this is more for the general public than for the scientists. But if you're in the field and you're using camera traps or you're shooting video for research purposes, we will provide a platform for that material. So you can get your material onto EcoFlix and get a global audience, as well as publishing your papers. And that way you inform people who don't necessarily read the scientific papers. The message is getting out there. This is The Guardian in 2015, so not a new story. Loss of monkeys and birds in tropical forests are driving up carbon emissions, because forest degradation isn't just hacking down small trees, it's actually killing animals. It's forest degradation is destroying parts of the ecosystem. So word is getting out, but no one had valued that until 2019, literally 3 years ago. An Italian biologist called Fabio Bazzaghi, his name is the last author on this paper, studied 2 areas of Congo Basin forests, one with a population of forest elephants, one where they've been extirpated years ago, decades ago. And he found the above ground biomass where there were elephants was 7% more. And he attributed that to the fact that elephants are feeding and trampling on many of the small plants and turning those small plants into manure that feeds the big mature trees. And if you look at estimates of carbon in the tropical rainforest, you'll find that a surprisingly large percentage is in the big trees. Because if you look at the volume of the forest, most of it is air. And then some of it is leaves and twigs and stems. And then every so often you hit a cubic meter of carbon, which is wood. So what elephants do is they do the weeding. They weed out the small plants and turn them into compost, or into manure, which feeds the big plants. And that results in that 7% difference. And what Ralph Sharmy did, the lead author, he's the assistant director at the International Monetary Fund, he calculated the value of that 7% difference and attributed it to the work done by each elephant over the course of his or her life. And it turns out that each elephant is responsible for the additional sequestration and storage of $1.75 million worth of carbon per elephant, as long as they're allowed to live their full life. Now, roughly 60 years, let's say, 1.75 million divided by 60 is 30,000 a year. If each elephant can earn 30,000 a year for a community, they're going to protect those elephants. That's $80 a day. So we are setting up a system called Rebalance Earth. Rebalance.earth is the website, where companies that want to offset their unavoidable greenhouse gas emissions, we all want to hit real zero, but in the interim, we have to offset those that we can't avoid. But as well as just offsetting the carbon, they're getting biodiversity value. They're lifting rural communities out of poverty. They're hitting several of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals in one credit. So it's not just a carbon credit, it's a biodiversity carbon poverty reduction credit. And the companies we're talking to, last night I was at a big event in London talking about this, and the way this is going to be done better than RED, which was subject to so much corruption, money just disappeared into other bank accounts and turned into villas in France or new Mercedes-Benzes. That isn't going to happen here because of the magic of blockchain. Now, you may have heard of blockchain in the context of cryptocurrency. This is a very different use of blockchain, one that doesn't use huge amounts of power. So it is a green way of transferring money in a digital way that is transparent and traceable. So the villager has access to the blockchain, as does the company that's putting in $1 million to offset its greenhouse gas emissions. And it's done per day's work per elephant, starting with elephants, because that's what the calculations have been done for. But I want you as primatologists to start looking at working out the difference that primates make in habitat. I reckon that a family of 20 to 30 gorillas equals 1 elephant. And that 1.75 million was based on the price of carbon in 2019 on the European exchange, which was then about $24 per ton. Now it's more than tripled. So actually now we're talking about upwards of $5 million per elephant, or per big group of gorillas, or perhaps a bigger community of chimpanzees. But if a community of 80 chimpanzees equals 1 elephant in terms of the nutrient cycling and role in the ecosystem, and of course apes do things that elephants can't do. Elephants are hopeless at climbing trees and building nests, but apes do that, and that creates a light gap which allows light down to the floor. And what apes do in a nest is, of course, poo when they get up. So they drop their seed-filled droppings beneath the nest, which is like a folded umbrella because it's created a nice comfortable platform to sleep on, and that opens up a gap in the canopy, so those seedlings have light. It's wonderful the way that these ecosystems work, but we have underappreciated it. And when we've appreciated it, we've been told, well, that's nice, but it's of academic interest. Thanks to Ralph's work, he's developed this new economic paradigm where living nature is worth money. At the moment, to make money out of nature, you've got to cut down the tree or kill the animal. And with Ralph's new economic paradigm, we have an alternative that can push back against those destructive forces. And we're hoping that's going to really help. And we're hoping also that the calculations will work for savanna elephants and other habitats, which in their own way are sequestering and storing carbon. So that's the message from this talk. If you value the forest, protect the gardeners. And now we have a valuation of the daily work done by each gardener. And it's going to transform conservation. And it's exciting to be telling you this, because you may not have heard any of this, but go to rebalance.earth and you can read how the ideas have evolved if you click on that. And please get involved. And when you're designing your research projects, have a mind to how that might have a practical application, because it's wonderful to satisfy our curiosity about primates just because we're curious. But we do actually need to ensure that they're around in the future for their sake and for ours. So thank you very much. If you have any questions and there is time, I'm happy to answer questions. Otherwise, it's a wrap.
Thanks a lot, Ian. That's excellent. Very, very inspirational. Thanks.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much. And I think we have time. I mean, there may be some people who want to ask some questions, and that was, I think, gave everybody so much to think about, and might take a moment before we get some from the audience. But if you don't mind, I wanted to kind of pick up that last thread that you left with, because I myself have been just kind of interested in this whole Web3 blockchain thing. And, you know, kind of ironically, or not ironically, but here you're talking about apes and new projects of using blockchain to support ape conservation, yet probably the most people or most people would associate blockchain and NFTs with bored apes. So in some ways it's there's some degree of what some people might call frivolousness, or just a lot of money being thrown around without kind of substance in some cases.
And
but
of course,
I actually
some of the NGOs are looking to that as a new way of fundraising.
That's what I was going to ask you about. If you know any other ways that people are trying to take the kind of public popularity of this idea towards conservation as well.
Definitely, it is happening, and sometimes it's slightly controversial because people associate cryptocurrency with mining Bitcoin, and that apparently uses vast amounts of power, so it's not a very green activity to be taking part in. But I am assured that the enterprise grade blockchain that is used by banks to transfer money in a traceable and trusted fashion, each transaction is less than an email in what it consumes. So it's well within our regular use of the internet, of sort of global networks. The company that through sponsorship has enabled the development of this blockchain is called R3. And R3, I was at an event at their headquarters in London last night, where the Rebalance Earth blockchain was giving its first public, to a small group of people there, live demonstration. And one of the developers said, well, it's like watching a little biplane trying to take off. And I observed that actually my late grandmother was born in 1900, and when she was a girl on the sands in Scarborough, she watched the Wright brothers giving demonstration flights of their first flying machine, and she lived to see people walking on the moon and Concorde flying across the Atlantic. And that maybe took 60, 70 years. We don't have 60 or 70 years. So the demonstration last night was to show how it's going to work, but we need to speed that development to a year or so. We are in talks with 2 African countries to set up a pilot project to prove the concept. It depends on individual animal recognition, which with elephants is sometimes easy because one's got a broken off tusk or a tear in the ear, and sometimes it's quite hard. But software is being developed for facial recognition of humans and now of apes, and we want that for elephants, because whilst we want to pay rangers and members of the community to monitor the animals, each time an animal is seen alive, it's like a factory worker clocking on in a factory. Actually, it's more like clocking off, because you've proved that you've done so many hours work. And so a sighting of a known animal who will be one of our client animals, whether it's an elephant or in the near future, other species, will be confirmation that that individual is alive and well and has done so many days' work since the last time he or she was seen. And that produces tokens for a day's work, which can be converted at some point into cash. And we see this as a collaborative venture with communities and local businesses. So the local store will collect the tokens and maybe once a month will redeem them into money. So the rangers will pay for their groceries, or the community members, you know, somebody complains because elephants have raided their crops. They take a picture, and we'll be providing them with phones with cameras. They can upload the picture. It's a client elephant. We know who it is. And that elephant hasn't been seen for 10 days. And if it's an $80 a day scheme, then that's suddenly $800 that is available for the community and the rangers. The division of that will have to be negotiated, obviously, with the government. But these tokens were assured by surveys of corporations and industry. They're prepared to pay much more than just for a carbon credit, because they're getting much more. And they can show their customers or their shareholders the elephants that are doing their carbon offsetting and see the benefits in terms of schools being built and community centers and medical clinics, all with the elephants' money. And that, of course, will transform the attitudes of the local people. Now, elephants are sympatric with many species of primates, so there will be a benefit to the primates just from that. But as we understand better, some of the money will be funding research. And it will give a value to, if you've got camera traps out there, your images are of academic value. You can write a paper on the behavior or whatever. But if those are also identifying known client animals, when we get to primates, you'll be able to be paid for the data, because you've just proved that that animal is alive and well. And it might not be millions of dollars, maybe it'll only be thousands of dollars, but it's still, it is a potential market for biodiversity monitoring, which is not based on how many species there are. At the moment, biodiversity credits are based around, well, how many species were there and how many are there? And if it's going up, you get more credit. If it's going down, you get less credit. But that's not functional. It's kind of arbitrary. But if you look at what each species does and the role that they play, those parts of the role that have a market value, the market is effectively paying workers. And my concern is that for most of the large mammals, we've lost 80 to 90% or more of the individuals. So it's like having a factory with 1,000 workers and you just laid off, or worse, killed 900 of them. The 100 that are left are going to have difficulty keeping up the productivity. And yet these ecosystems are sustaining life on Earth in many respects, generating rain and sequestering carbon and producing oxygen, all the good things that we expect of them. And yet we've reduced the workforce by 80 or 90%. It's scary, but from the economic point of view, if you allow those ecosystems to recover and the populations to recover, then that makes them more valuable. Because what Ralph did is not only calculate the work done by today's elephants are the fathers and mothers of tomorrow's elephants. And if you look into the future, say 100, 150 years, all that carbon that is sequestered and stored as a result of elephant activity won't happen if the elephant today is killed. That's why the value is so high. Of today, you're protecting the stock of elephants that will produce the gardeners of tomorrow. And that concept of allowing numbers to recover so that they're at the optimum level in a forest to maximize the ability of the forest to provide the ecosystem services, not just the carbon, but the oxygen and the water, that makes them really valuable. And we hope that in countries like Gabon, where they still have a healthy population of forest elephants, to demonstrate that preventing their loss will keep Gabon is a carbon positive country. It sequesters still far more than they produce in their emissions. And countries like Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, which have lost most of their elephants, allowing them to recover will bring new value to those forests. It is potentially transformative, and it is, I said, beyond exciting to be involved in trying to make it happen. But we need a lot of hands to the pump, as it were, and for primatologists to start thinking in these terms would be really helpful. Yeah. So I hope the students who are watching this, if they're looking at what research topic to cover, see if there isn't an ecological aspect that can, with the help of a suitably motivated economist, and traditionally economics regards nature as an externality. We've got this lovely economic system and nature's over there, you don't worry about that. Where obviously, as was said by an economist who's on our side, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. Without nature, there is no economy.
It's brilliant.
Yeah, so sorry, you asked a question and I went on for another half hour. But,
it's perfect though.
Any questions from the, there's one in the chat. Is that a question or is it?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I want to go to
comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to go to Nahoko. You have a question from YouTube.
Yeah, thank you for your great talk. There is one question on YouTube from Kerry. She asked that she said that the expansion of volcano is an impressive project, but it is also very sensitive and difficult with regard to the human displacement aspect. So how is this being managed? I think this is a very important question.
The Rwandan authorities will explain that they are discussing with the families that are farming there relocation and compensation. So it's been done with free prior informed consent that the UN requires these decisions to be made using. And bear in mind, it is reclaiming land that was only lost 40, 50 years ago. So it's not long-term traditional ownership. It is land that was given by the government to families, and the government is now deciding actually it's in our interest and the world's interest to restore some of that land to forest. For the people who farm there, it has been a difficult few decades because they've had the genocide and the civil war and the restructuring of Rwandan society, which used to be largely agricultural. Everyone just lived on a plot of land and farmed it. And that's becoming increasingly untenable because when the older generation died, they would leave little parcels of land to their kids. And now people are farming a little patch over there, a little patch over there. It needs something of an overhaul. So around the volcanoes, they have been persuading people to live in communities that we would call towns or villages. Rwanda didn't traditionally have towns and villages. They had people living on the land and market towns where people would bring their crops to sell, but there wasn't a big residential area around each town, and that's changing. So Rwanda is changing, and the government sees its biggest asset as a relatively small but densely populated country as its people. So it's focused on education, on technology. The government had fiber optic cable laid between all the towns because they want Rwanda to become a service economy. They want to provide internet services to the world. What vision! It's extraordinary. And that's happening within this previously troubled, but at the moment stable country. But right next door, they're facing the unrest that the DRC is still facing. And the DRC, being a much bigger country, 2/3 the size of Western Europe, is much harder to organize. And that's a real threat. So it's extraordinary that the park on the Rwanda side is expanding and tourism is going just over the border. The terrorist and militia attacks, and but the Rwandan army forms a very strong defensive ring along the border in the forest, which itself creates a conservation issue But many of the soldiers who have been living in the forest for security reasons have had opportunity to watch gorillas. And I've talked to some of them, and they're as entranced by the gorillas as we are. So just because you carry a gun and defend your country doesn't mean that you're not interested in conservation. And there are great examples where that has happened. A lady called, her name has just gone out of my head, working in Cabinda, Tamar Ron, working in Cabinda, convinced all the soldiers to join nature clubs. You've got pictures of these guys with bullets and guns and their nature club badge. So you have to deal with whoever is in charge or influential in the country and try and bring them on side, whether they're driving a bulldozer or carrying a gun, because inside every one of them is the naturalists that they were as a child. You just have to capture that interest, I think. I see a hand raised from Cassia. Hello, Cassia.
Yeah, if you don't mind, if we have time for another question, Kasia.
There we are.
Hello.
Is it all right? Is the microphone working okay?
It is, although unless you're in a crowded area, you can drop the mask and we can see you.
I'm in a room with other students, so I'll keep it.
You have to wear it.
I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry, it would be nice to see your face, but now I can hear your voice. So
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you so much for sharing your infectious passion with us. That was really interesting to listen to. And
I'm sorry, a mask is no defense against infectious passion.
It really isn't, even at a distance. I'm hooked.
But if you spend any time around Kasia, you know it goes in both directions.
Good. So I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. What was your point?
That's right. So I wanted to say, because I was actually thrilled, as someone who I've got behind me, I'm just beginning my career, but I've already got under my belt about 10 years of working in field biology and exotic animal husbandry. So I was particularly thrilled right at the beginning of your presentation this evening to hear you highlight about how our attitudes towards close contact with animals have changed, and they've changed so dramatically. And that's something, as part of my work, that I've spent a lot of time trying to highlight to people. But I wanted to ask you, in the spirit of that, I'm sure you've seen through your work that people seem to crave this close contact, that people like Diane Fossey or Dave Attenborough or Steve Irwin, all of these greats had with the animals. People seem to want that. That's their first kind of instinct, their first reaction. They want to get up close with animals. What are your thoughts on how to get the public to connect with wildlife without this close contact? And also, if you have some thoughts about why you think people are still attracted to that, what is the appeal behind even taking pictures with yourself with orangutans in clothing? What is the driving force behind that based on your experiences, and what is the cure to that?
Well, how long have we got? This sounds like the perfect opportunity to introduce my ooh, ah, ha, ha, ha hypothesis.
Brilliant.
Okay. Which I developed in connection with the primate pet trade, but which it applies in many of these situations, and indeed with social media and the desire to have yourself in close proximity to an animal. Very often that proximity is brought about by control. And I think we are a species that works in dominance hierarchies, and people enjoy the control. They can dominate their pet, their working animals. They control it. The animal does what they say. So it sort of feeds into human desire for dominance. But the ooh, ah, ha, ha hypothesis goes deeper. So let me explain that. We're talking about the 3 C's of human nature. Firstly, curiosity. We are a curious species. We've been talking about it, and we want to encourage curiosity in our children. We want them to look with wonder, and that wide-eyed wonder, that ooh, is how people react to something new and unexpected. And if you can elicit that response, then you have the attention of those around you. And ooh is a vocalization that predates language and is quite close to a lot of ape vocalizations. That's the first C, curiosity. Then the second C is compassion. Okay, we are a compassionate species, we care. And when you have proximity to an ape, a baby monkey or a baby lion, the vocalization is it's again, probably predates language, but it expresses a caring, compassionate concern. So, ooh, ah. And the third C is comedy, because we as a species value comedy. And you're not going to be spending very long with apes or other primates or many animals without finding something funny, what they do. And you laugh, ha, ha, ha. Again, a non-verbal vocalization that predates language, I'm sure. I'd say I'm sure. How do I know? Wasn't around, but one can extrapolate. And we know that apes laugh. You know, you tickle a baby gorilla or a chimpanzee. So these are all vocalizations that you can see a parallel in our cousins. And I think each of them, if you can initiate that vocalization from your community, your peers, will raise your status. So if you can stand up and do an amazing trick and everyone's, oh, ooh, then you've got their attention and you have social status. If you have a baby ape and everyone's crowding around going, ah, isn't it lovely? Ah, you've got their attention. You are the center of attention, and that raises your social status. And the ha ha ha. Well, we pay comedians to stand and entertain us in vast halls, all of us wanting together to go ha ha ha. And therefore that person who has that skill to get an audience to respond is put on a pinnacle and gains in social status. So I think it's deep in our human psyche. I have not yet elaborated this in a publication. I'm so sorry. I should have a paper on the ha 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 hypothesis. I've expounded it in a number of talks, so you're hearing it here. But I think it explains a lot. And you see in everyday life that happening. Someone's got a big dog, everybody goes, ooh, look at that. And they find that it's just a puppy and isn't it nice? And then it rolls over and does something daft and you burst out laughing. And your respect for that person, because they're controlling the dog, goes up. So it feeds into our human hierarchical thinking in a way that has led to, and we come to the fourth C in human nature, commerce. You can make money. If you've got any of those skills, you can make people go, ooh, ah, ha, ha, ha. You can make money. And so the trade in animals that you can bring to novel animals that elicit that response because of the curiosity. Oh, what's that? I haven't seen one of those before. And all the rest can follow. Then you, if you're a dealer in ooh, ah, ha, 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 inducing organisms, then you can make a lot of money. And the social media is full of that. What gets you lots of clicks and likes, approval, an arresting image, or an ability to do a really nice dance on TikTok or a gymnastic flip, and people go, oh, wow, look at that. I just shared yesterday a record pole vaulter, 6 point something meters, and the slow-mo of that human going in upside down over the bar. It's like, whoa, that's another one. Ooh, ah, ha, 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 whoa. But all these non-verbal communications that would, if they are elicited, then the person responsible gets status. And that's what I think is behind a lot of this. And I'm not saying, the picture I asked Lorna Annis, the then research assistant, to take of me grooming Pablo's shoulder was because I was working on a paper, which is still not published, I'm so sorry, on gorilla parasites, on their ectoparasites. And I wanted to illustrate my research methods. Now, of course, it's rather embarrassing because I wasn't wearing a mask. We didn't do so in those days. And we try and maintain 10-meter distance unless the animal is anesthetized, and then everyone's in masks. But the deeper philosophical message behind that is that I was not controlling Pablo. He came of his own volition to sit next to me because he remembered me. And whilst I was interested in doing research on him, he was interested in rekindling an old friendship. And the fact that you can have interspecies friendships with animals, I think is different from the desire to control them. So circus tricks require the animal to be trained and do something on command. Spontaneous events like that happen. And was I not going to photograph it? Well, no, actually, I was thinking, oh, I'm writing a paper on lice. I need someone to show that it is possible with unanesthetized wild animals. If they trust you, you can actually groom them and find specimens which will teach you about the life cycle of lice and the interaction between primates and ectoparasites, which of course leads to grooming, which I agree with Robin Dunbar, goes on to language and is an important part of primate society. So we owe a lot to the ectoparasites, causing us to carefully groom each other and initiate social relationships. But then you present that and it looks very much like the picture of someone on holiday having their photograph taken for their social media profile with a non-human primate. And so I ask people in lectures not to photograph those pictures and share them on social media. I do them in a controlled environment. I realize this is going to go out on the internet and people might well grab a screen grab, and I have no control over that. And some of my colleagues would say, well, just don't show them, but they're out there. This is going back to the 80s, and the pictures for conservation charities that get the most fundraising support are the pictures where people can empathize. And if you can show, yes, these are not just an endangered species, these are individual autonomous beings that are in charge of their own life and they're steering their own course. They don't need humans, but they are prepared to tolerate humans and sometimes even prepared to apparently quite like the company of certain humans who they trust. And that changes people's perception of the campaign to save them. It's not, I use this in some lectures, you know, I've got a lovely picture of a little red-legged tree frog that shares the same habitat as the mountain gorillas. And I say to an audience of what, a few hundred people, would you have come out tonight to hear about the conservation of the red-legged tree? It's cute, it's got red legs, but it doesn't have the same connection. And I think we've got to use every weapon, every tool in our toolbox, never mind weapons, every tool in our toolbox. And the empathy tool is an important one. So I use those pictures with lots of caveats and a certain amount of apology to my colleagues who would rather I didn't, because I do think that in terms of gaining public support for what we're trying to do, they are a really important tool. And I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if we stop showing any pictures of anybody having that relationship with a non-human primate, I think we are losing a lot of potential support from the public. But you do have to then say, this is not something you should try. And you know, we didn't know that Pablo was going to come and sit on David Attenborough. It wasn't in the script. They didn't film the first part of that because this was in the days of 16mm film and they've only got a few rolls of film and they've got the rest of the trip to film. So like today, you can just let the camera run and it's just data on a hard drive. But then it was carefully plotted shots. And it was to John Sparks's credit that he said to Martin Saunders, the cameraman, I'll just shoot a few feet of this because it'll give the guys in the cutting room a bit of a laugh. And then it was used in the program and it changed people's perceptions of gorillas forever. Yeah. Sorry, a long-winded answer, but a good question.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Published or not, I'll be sure to quote the ooh-aha hypothesis the next time I'm inevitably asked this question myself. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, yeah, the three C's of human nature that we like and we want. And this is the people who have exotic pets are people who have got that. Look at that. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. I want to have that. And then when my friends come around, they'll say, oh, look at that, it's beautiful. It's a perfectly natural thing. I don't think we need to demonize them because I, as a boy, kept a lot of animals. And I realize now that I was basically a predator of frogs and caterpillars. Occasionally I got them through to release back into the wild, but a lot of them died at my inexpert care. But what do? Do you say to a young naturalist, no, don't do that? Well, nowadays I think people say yes, but leave it where it is because now I would say it has a role to play in the ecology. Look, it's eating insects. Those could be eating your cabbages or so trying to teach people ecology and encourage their curiosity and their compassion. And I don't think it will have to be po-faced. Sometimes it's really funny. but in a way that allows the individual animal, whether it's a caterpillar or a gorilla, to continue its role in the ecosystem that we're benefiting from. That's the kind of thing. I think it's what will get people to understand that, yeah, it would be nice to have that animal in my room at home to show my friends, but an animal in captivity is unemployed. It has a job. Yeah. It's either controlling prey species, or it's eating vegetation and producing manure, dispersing seeds. And if it's walking around a yard in a zoo or in someone's bedroom in a tank, it's not playing that role. It's unemployed. And we have seen such a reduction in the number of animals, as you will have read the Living Planet report, so that 60-something% of individual animals it has been, we've seen a reduction of 60% of individual animals, not species, just there are fewer of everything. And in mammals, it's much higher, 80-something%. And for elephants, it's 90-something%, and gorillas and they're the most important animals. So we have to, if we're going to solve the biodiversity, the climate, and the pollution problem. Well, pollution is sort of separate measures, but it's important because it's affecting biodiversity and climate. And just while I'm at it, this book, this is a preprint, it's not out yet. It's just starting pre-orders online. It's called Wildlife in the Balance by Simon Musto. I think it's possibly the most important book of our time. And I encourage you to have a look at it. And what Simon has done is explained a lot of this ecology in the context of energy. How plants are basically capturing energy from the sun, and then animals are using that energy and storing it. And without animals and plants, there's just a lot of free energy and chaos. And he talks about entropy and how animals are helping to slow down entropy. And when we remove the animals, you get the kind of problems that we're seeing when systems that have evolved over millennia, millions of years, break down. So restoring animal populations is central to maintaining a living planet. And I encourage you to look at it. There you go, Simon. I've given you a book a plug too. Well, books. Also, get a copy of Gorilla Pathology in Health, because I wrote all the parasite bits.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think we could keep going. It seems like you're prepared to keep going. I'm sure that everyone in the audience still has so many more questions, but I think it's probably a good time to at least shut down the YouTube live stream here. So on behalf of us here at Kyoto University and SciCast, thanks so much for doing this. It was wonderful. And you really gave us so many things to think about and talk about, I think, in the coming days and weeks and months. And congratulations on all of the stuff that you're involved into. I think it is exciting and it's infectious, and many of us may have new ideas as well to put out there.
If we get it right, I can just go back to being a naturalist and observing and enjoying, with a half decent chance that the animal I'm looking at isn't about to be killed by somebody with a very different agenda. But that's my personal ambition to not be a conservationist, because we've sorted that.
Right. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for providing an audience and a global platform. And I encourage you all to look at EcoFlix, because we'll have talks like this on EcoFlix, not just the videos and documentaries, but sort of serious discussions between conservationists. And I'm sure some of you will get roped in to do a podcast or an interview on EcoFlix, including the ones who are just starting out on their career, because we want to hear the voices of young primatologists as well as the old farts like us.
All right.
Thanks a lot.